Hi, I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lecture, I'm going to talk about how to use practical theology to engage with science, social sciences, and other disciplines. I'm someone who I have deep roots in the fields of science. I went to MIT, which is considered one of the top scientific and engineering schools in the world, and I thrive there. And I also have spent the past 25 or 30 years working in ministry. So I've thought a lot about how these different fields relate. And if you look at, and this is kind of the outline, what I'm going to talk about first is how practical theology relates to other disciplines. So is it a marginalized discipline, or is it a secular versus sacred battle, or is it a lens to view all other disciplines, as in a practical theology of X discipline? And I'm arguing for the last. And then how your ministry's unique identity influences how it approaches different frameworks for practical theology, modern versus postmodernism, counseling, psychology, and Christianity, and cross-cultural ministry and race. So let's just start with the question of, is theology a marginalized discipline or queen of the sciences? So in pre-modern times, theology was at times a tyrant of the sciences and abuses of the Catholic Church. We've all learned those historical lessons with Galileo and others. And I think that the modern reaction to that was, a lot of different things, but really what modernism did is it recognized that specializations of academic disciplines was helpful. So instead of doing everything integrated, we would specialize, and by doing that, knowledge became too complex, so one person couldn't master all disciplines, and by specializing, we're able to understand each discipline and create, specialization. So that's what modernism did, is it broke the world into silos, into categories. But what that did is it moved theology from this all-encompassing discipline to becoming a marginalized discipline. And that's the current framing in academia right now, and I'll talk about what that looks like. I would like to argue an updated framing that theology can be viewed as a queen of the sciences if we see it from God's perspective, combining all disciplines at once with all knowledge at once. Now, the short answer to that is we can't do that. We can't see all perspectives at once like God can. But I think that is how God views the world. He's able to see all perspectives at once. We just can't do that. So you could think about theology being that from God's view, but we're too limited for that. But I do think that Christians wanting to help solve society's great problems should take a holistic, interdisciplinary approach using multiple lenses to strive towards an integrated understanding and solution. So combining head, heart, and hands in multiple lenses. And if we can't see in all perspectives at once, we can learn about the different perspectives, and then we can try on the different lenses to get an integrated understanding. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to take a holistic, interdisciplinary approach to help Christian ministries address society's great problems related to poverty and addiction. So let's first talk about how universities are organized. So this is a broad brush, so it's not exact, but basically you can organize disciplines into those that are focused on the individual, and those that are focused on the collective, and those that are more subjective, and those that are more internally focused versus those that are more externally focused. And you have, and I'm borrowing from Ken Wilber, some of his framework, but I've kind of adapted it quite a bit. So you have quadrant 1, the personal and nurture, that's humanities and social sciences. Quadrant 2, nature, so that's science and technology, that's the physical. So here it's still kind of individual level, physical level. You got cultural, so that is collective, internal. And then you have societal, so that's collective, external. That's the social sciences, a lot of the group-based social sciences, not the individual-based social sciences. So here you have humanities. You have a lot of Western theology has been put into this quadrant as a marginalized discipline. You have ministry, counseling, individual psychology, and art for self. And then here you have biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, medicine, psychiatry, healthcare, life sciences, nutrition, exercise science. And then here you have ethnic, gender, cultural studies, anthropology, ethics, non-Western Christian theology, worship music, art for others. And here you have societal, you have organizational and business management, microeconomics. Then you have macro, which is more social psychology, sociology, law, political science, economics, history, and ecology. So these are the more external, kind of the bigger groupings with collective, and these are the more individual. Now, there's kind of a question of how do we relate to the world. So the idea of practical theology, I mentioned, you could have a practical theology for each of these. So what's a practical theology of counseling? What's a practical theology of ethics? Practical theology of anthropology? All of these can have their own practical theology. Now, this is one way of viewing the world. The other is that theology is a marginalized academic discipline. It has to be a discipline just within the academic world. You have to be able to have departments. That's just the way accreditation works. But having said that, this is more the view that we have on this. So another kind of way of viewing things is you have the sacred secular divide, and you have personal beliefs, church religion, you have Sunday, and you have secular sources, counseling, psychology, sociology, science, and the other 6 days. And Paul Stevens, who wrote the book The Other 6 Days, he said that, and he's a big theology of work guy, he said that sacred secular dualism is the worst heresy of the Christian church worldwide. This is a heresy because the whole world is sacred and under God. So, this is more of a view, a correct biblical view than this is kind of the point. Okay, so that's the first point, was how does practical theology relate to the other disciplines? And the fact is it can be a lens that you can interpret all disciplines is kind of the main point. Now, the second part of this talk, I want to talk about how who you are relates to your approach of practical theology. And in the last lecture, I talked about you kind of have this perspective of typology of faith-based organizations, and you have on one extreme, you have Bible-only biblicism. The other side, you have secular sources-only secularism. And then in the middle, you got biblical engagement. So that's complex interaction of the Bible and other disciplines. So if you're on the most traditional and traditional, you're going to be more cautious on a lot of these things. So then you have different schools of thought on, if you actually study the field of practical theology, you kind of have, ranging from the fundamentalist applied theology, where basically you don't touch anything but the Bible, is one extreme, whereas the other is the highly skeptical approaches, say to counseling or psychology or other things like that. And then you have more complex integrative, and then you have liberal practical theology, then you have secular framing of practical theology, which is just basically like, it's something those weird religious people do. It's kind of, maybe that's a little too harsh, but whereas liberal practical theology would be more like mainline denominations of practical theology. Now, if you look up a book on practical theology, or often if you look up applied theology, it's going to be in the more highly skeptical. Practical theology might vary. Sometimes it's more in this middle space. Sometimes it's more on the liberal, and they don't usually tell you at the beginning of the book where they what their perspective is, and you have to kind of sort that out. So City Vision gets is going to span these groups, but we're aligned with our student population, and we're not going to cover the fundamentalist or the secular framing. All right, now there's kind of a question of why would it make sense to have different levels of engagement? And whenever I say different levels of engagement, I'm talking about this side doesn't engage much, this side engages a lot. So why does it make sense? Well, there's a need for different levels of contextualization. It's not simply a one-size-fits-all approach. Sometimes you have to have a lot of cultural fluency to engage with a specific audience. And so, for example, if you are a Christian biologist, you're going to need a lot of fluency to engage with that group. And then recognizing that anything that's a Christian cultural norms often distorted and fallen. So an oversimplified view of engagement that we got to be, very skeptical of everything, um, can result in legalism, and often it's where political identity is dominating Christian identity and biblical teaching. So what does all that mean? Let me just use a good example. InterVarsity, their primary mission is serving students largely at elite colleges, or at high-end colleges at least, and requiring highly sophisticated engagement with postmodern philosophy, frameworks on race and culture, and science. So if you're at InterVarsity, and I attended off and on InterVarsity at MIT, and you're engaging with science, you need to have fluency in that audience, and you need to be able to engage, deeply there. Now, urban ministries are going to need a highly sophisticated engagement with postmodern philosophy and frameworks on race and culture, because if you don't have the ability to engage on race and have fluency in that, and you're in an urban ministry, in most contexts, you're not going to be able to have a good dialogue across racial lines. And then in addiction recovery, often you'll need a highly sophisticated engagement with counseling in the field. So the point of this is, these different views are needed in different contexts, right? But what you need to do is recognize that often the type of faith-based organization might influence your approach. And I'm trying to do a semi-map. Integrative practical theology really cuts across traditional critical mass FBO, protected pluralist. Then there's the highly skeptical. So the most traditional FBOs usually are aligned with highly skeptical. And the liberal practical theology is usually the amorphous pluralist faith-based organization. So if you're an organization that's critical mass FBO, you're going to be comfortable with this. You're not going to be as comfortable there, or vice versa with some of these, is kind of the idea. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you go into and this is just the level of skepticism, so skeptical of secular knowledge and theological tradition. So if you take different topics like postmodernism, and you start to engage with books on postmodernism, how much are you going to engage with those? Are you going to be highly, skeptical of the postmodern perspective, or are you going to have complex contextualization with postmodern? And a good book on this that I read, and I love the title of it, is "Truth is Stranger Than It Used to Be." So the assumption in that is there's still truth, but it's more complex to sort through than the old modernist framing of truth. And then you have liberal Christian postmodernism and then secular postmodernism. So a lot of City Vision's view is kind of going to be, we'll have students that are coming from all of these perspectives. Sometimes we'll get students that are in the liberal Christian postmodernism, but, our view is that both modern and postmodern framings are flawed. But to construct an informed Christian holistic perspective, it's helpful to learn from postmodern deconstructions. And as I talked about in history, often deconstruction looks like, someone in recovery, or a marriage that's broken. Often it has to get worse before it gets better. Well, in it getting worse, you have to understand what went wrong. And that's a lot of what deconstruction does, is it helps you understand, what went wrong. So let's take that towards counseling in Christianity. So, one way of framing it is three approaches to counseling in Christianity. You got the anti-integration group, you got the counseling integration group, and then you got secular counseling. And what we're trying to do is to do integration with a biblically dominant worldview. Often what happens is you get weak integration. Now, the book that we use in our primary course on Christian integration is Integrative Approaches to Counseling in Christianity, and it presents 6 different views. And it talks about the Christian combatants, that's nouthetic counseling, and then he calls it the colonialist. So these are people who are Christian authors who write about counseling, but basically they're only proof texting the counseling books and applying it in Christian context without actually learning from the field. Basically, they have very surface level knowledge They're kind of misapplying it in many cases. Then you have what he calls domestic spies, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but that's where you're learning from the other side. Then you have the rebuilders, where you're trying to basically create a whole new field called Christian psychology. And then you have allies, where you have an integration model, and then you have the neutral parties, and you have the point of this is which of these is most applicable depends on your context. So primarily pastors and Christian counselors in churches, it's going to make sense to have something that's much more focused on the Bible. But if you're in a Christian organization that takes insurance, you're probably going to need to be somewhere in here. And if you're a Christian counselor in a secular organization, you're going to have to be, deal with their rules there. So, and as you go across, you have increased compatibility with norms of secular counseling. So with City Vision, we have a range of what we'll teach intentionally. And we expose students to a range of views, and we recognize that our focus is on strong worldview integration. So we'll get people from all of these spaces, but this is what we'll promote. Now, you could use the same type of thing towards practical theology and cross-cultural ministry and approaches to race. And I use this framework. On one side, you have ministries that are nearly all white versus ministries that are nearly all non-white. And on one side, you have white fundamentalist Christians, and then you have white evangelicals, Christian ministries, and these percentages are often where our students would come from. And you have these different authors like Brian Fickert, Bob Lupton, Ray Bakke, Tim Keller, that are often some of the best known authors around these topics on cross-cultural ministry and approaches to race. And then you have the reconcilers. So these are typically highly multi-ethnic, Bible-based ministries and Christian builders. So the original Christian Community Development Association movement was in this space. John Perkins, a lot of the books in InterVarsity Press around race on this. Brenda Salter McNeil, Miles McPherson, George Yancey, these are all reconcilers, and they're intentional bridge builders. A lot of our students, that's probably the biggest group of our students, are kind of in that space. And then you have what I would call working class people of color. They're Bible-based Christians. They're not going to be as intellectual as some of these other groups that are out there. And then you have this group that, to use Du Bois's term, of the talented 10th. So the talented 10th in the African-American community, his theory of change was if you focus on the talented 10th, then you can bring the most change because they can then help the other 90%. So that's typically an upper middle class, people of color, and Bible-based Christians. So increasingly, a lot of the intellectual discussions happening in this space. So that is more on InterVarsity Press books that are written by people of color for people of color. A lot of these books are written honestly for white folks. And so you have different authors here. And a lot of the more recent CCDA movement, Christian Community Development Movement, is in this space. And then you have secular radical identity political movements out there that generally, isn't where City Vision is focused. So we'll span these four groups, and we emphasize our material based on our student population. So I think the main point of this is, if you understand who you are as an organization, you can start to understand what frameworks you can engage with. If you take different courses that we have, so this course, this framework here is used in some of our cross-cultural courses. You start to find your tribe that aligns with your values. And ultimately what you're trying to do is to get a deeper practical theology. So if you want to get a practical theology of race, here are some authors, and you want to try to find them that are aligned with you. So hopefully you find this helpful. Thanks a lot.